Okay, so to understand ecology, you need to know the levels of organization first. So, what are they? Well, the most basic level of organization is an individual, which an individual is a single living thing. So, think about it like a single ant, a single rat, a single deer, whatever, a single person. And then from individuals, you can have a species. So, a species is is a group formed by individuals, and it's the largest group in which the individuals can still reproduce with each other. So they have to be able to reproduce with each other. And then it goes in a sort of different direction because from species you go to a population. Now, what a population is members of a species, the same one, located in a particular space and time. So a good example of this would say be deer, species of deer, and they're all living in, say, Cincinnati. They're all living in Cincinnati right now. Then from populations, you go into communities. Now, what a community is, it's basically a lot of populations. So, say a population of deer. Um, it's it's populations of different species that interact together. So, mice, something like that. Even though they don't directly interact, but I'm sure you get the point. So, a community is populations of different species in a similar place that interact with each other. And then you go to an ecosystem. Now, what an ecosystem really is it's the level of organization in which abiotic factors interact with these communities. Now, that's not to say a single deer will interact with an abiotic factor like, say, air or things along those lines, but rather it's just the level of organization at which we keep track of these interactions. And then if you have a whole ecosystem, the next level is, well, a biosphere. And a biosphere is just really broad. A biosphere just means all the ecosystems on our planet. And to be honest, it's not very useful for anything in particular. It's just the highest level of organization there is. And from this, we can start talking about populations of, well, these species. And what we want to focus on right now is population size and particularly how they grow. So typically, when you see a population growing, let's say this is population size, and we say for, I don't know, a population, individuals of X over time, you typically see something like this: exponential growth, which means that over time, as time goes on, uh, there is more, number of individuals in the population grows at an increasing rate. Now, there's a different type of growth. So this is called exponential growth, but there's a different type of growth. It's called logistic growth. And now, what logistic growth really means is that you have another population, say y time, and at first the population grows exponentially, but then eventually it'll level off at a certain point. And from there, we can go to the types of species that grow in these various methods. So we have K-strategists and R-strategists. Now, K-strategists, they typically use logistic growth. So K-strategists typically have a few large offspring, and these offspring require lots of parental care. And because of that, these individuals typically have a relatively longer lifespan, and they also exist close to the carrying capacity. Now, what the carrying capacity is, otherwise known as K, is the maximum amount of individuals that an ecosystem can sustain in the long run. Now, K-strategists, I'm hoping that you see the resemblance name. They typically exist close to the carrying capacity. So what that means is, since they have logistic growth, the cutoff is typically just below the carrying capacity, or K. And what that results in is a lot of competition, because since there's so many individuals that exist to an amount where that's basically as much as the ecosystem can provide sustainably, you're going to have a lot of competition for resources. Now, what are resources? Well, in this case, it's going to be things like food or mates. And that's going to be what levels off this population, along with a few other factors. Now, let's move on to R-strategists. R-strategists typically have, well, exponential growth. So they just continue growing over time. Now, R-strategists typically have lots of offspring. That's how they're able to achieve this very high growth rate. They also have short lifespans, so they reproduce relatively early. And when they reproduce, the offspring are typically small and, well, self-sufficient. So think about things like insects, mosquitoes. And what you tend to see with particularly insects that are R-strategists is that their population size is highly cyclical. So what that means is that something like this happens. So it goes up a lot and it suddenly crashes, and then it goes up and it crashes, and then it goes up, and it just keeps happening. And typically the reason for these crashes is, well, seasons. So things like cold weather during winter can result in this sudden die-off. So like when winter sets on, most of the population dies off, but a few survive, and typically there's enough that survive so that when, say, summer comes, there's enough that they regrow the population. And that's really why a lot of our strategists reproduce with a lot of offspring, because they're typically in unpredictable or changing environments that require them to be able to produce a lot of offspring so as to ensure at least some survival. Now, we can also go back to K-strategists, and we can talk about what factors limits them. So what puts them here? It's not like every individual in the species just decides to not reproduce as much, and just because they don't know the carrying capacity. So factors that control a population, well, first of all, you have natality. Now, what natality is it's just the birth rate. And then the opposite of that is mortality, which is the death rate. And then you also have things I mentioned prior, such as competition. Now, there's two types of competition. You have interspecific competition and intraspecific competition. Now, the difference between these two is, well, we can think about it, inter versus intra. So intraspecific competition is competition between members of the same species. So you can probably guess, and you'll be right, that interspecific competition means members of different species. And along with competition, so let's list competition. You also have other factors. So you can also split these factors into two sections: density dependent and density independent. So the difference between these two is that, well, density dependent means these factors rely on how dense the population is. Now, some other density dependent factors would be things like disease. And as we mentioned prior, competition. Now, some density independent things would be weather. Weather is the same no matter how many individuals you got. And, well, from weather, climate. So this should leave you with a basic understanding of the levels of organization for ecology, as well as some of the factors affecting population sizes and what types of species there are that utilize different types of growth.